And so my name is Caitlin Kennedy. I oversee the Rentwell program. It's a tenant education program. It is a program of transition projects, but it is both statewide in Oregon and Washington. There are many different agencies that utilize it. It teaches people about their rights and responsibilities when it comes to renting. With that, I need to let you all know that I am indeed not a lawyer. I read a bunch of landlord tenant law, so I can tell you a lot of information, but I am not a lawyer. I do have some contacts over at the legal aid services, so if people have questions or need anything, we can connect you. That being said, we're going to get rolling into so many moratoriums. So we're going to start at the federal level, and then we'll move through from there. I will probably spend the most amount of time on the Oregon moratorium because I feel like it's the most complex and secure for the tenants that we're serving and the folks that we work with. Federal moratorium covers everybody. It's across the US. So it was just recently extended. It usually tends to get to the very end of where it's at before it lapses, and then they push it out again. So the Biden administration pushed it out again. It will end at this moment, June 30th, 2021. This is specifically for any evictions that would happen after September 4th, 2020, or any evictions that were starting in the process but weren't necessarily finalized by that date. Any of those evictions are just in a freeze. It is important to know that this is not any kind of rent forgiveness. Rent is still due for those time periods. It's just landlords across the US cannot evict based on this. There are some stipulations that landlords need to go through, or tenants need to go through in order for them to be protected on a federal level. So those being, every adult member of the household needs to qualify under 5 different stipulations and send a document to their landlord that they fall under these 5 and therefore they are requesting being protected under the federal eviction moratorium. So the very first is they've tried to obtain rental assistance. They are low income. For one individual, that would be less than $99,000 for the last tax year. If it's a couple, it would be twice as much. They have been unable to pay either their full amount of rent or make partial payments due to loss of income, loss of job, severe medical debt as well is all grouped in there. They've attempted to try to at least make some partial payments on rent. And if they were evicted, the option of them facing homelessness or having to double or triple up with others would indeed cause a burden, and the social distancing factor of that would become an issue. So an individual would need to sign a document stating that all of these are true for them. Every adult household member needs to sign one of these. They don't necessarily have to add all the documents proving each one of these to be true, but I highly recommend having them because a landlord can go, I don't necessarily believe you, and start a court process in order to request that the tenant show that they do indeed match all 5 of these. So even though the landlord doesn't need it, I would make sure to get all those documents together just in case. With the newest version of this federal moratorium, there were additional protections that were involved here too that I wanted to cover. The first one is that any previous signed version of the declaration still stands. Landlords do not have to go, nope, that was old, sign a new one. Nope, it's still good. If somebody was possibly exposed or had COVID or does have COVID and they're a tenant of a place, they cannot be evicted if they are following all the health precautions they possibly can to stay safe and keep the community safe. It can't just be the landlord assuming then that if an individual has tested positive for COVID, then there's a concern that they may infect everybody else at the rental unit. And so they're asking them to leave for the safety of the entire unit. However, if they are not following the guidelines specifically laid out for the health and safety, like if they're coughing on other tenants, like that is a reason to move forward to evict them. What is really exciting is tenants do not have to actually sign the official declaration paperwork that is laid out by the CDC. It's available, but they don't have to sign that one as long as they sign a copy that states that they still fall under those 5 stipulations and they are not lying about that. So as long as they sign something and get that to their landlord, that suffices too. So particularly if somebody doesn't have access to a printer, but they have a copy of the CDC, they can handwrite the entire thing, sign that, and send that over to the landlord, and that counts as well. It can also be translated into the language that the tenant is most comfortable with too, and that gets to qualify. And then one household member can choose to submit all the paperwork for the entire household. So each adult member should sign their own declaration, but instead of each member having to give it to the landlord, it can be grouped all in one and given over. One thing that I do worry about with this is during this time frame that landlords are not getting rent, they can still be charging late rent fees under the federal protections, which feels really concerning to me. If somebody is a certain amount of rent per day is your late fee, this is going to add up over the last year. So I'm a little concerned about what that will look like. But for Oregon specifically, the federal guideline also says, hey, if there is local jurisdiction or state jurisdiction that is stronger protections for tenants, follow those, don't follow these. So a landlord can't pick and choose. We have stronger protections in the state of Oregon, and that's why I was going to focus on that one the most. So that being said, let's move on over to Oregon. Oregon has had quite a bit of different versions of protections through this time period. Some of them have been executive orders by the governor, and some of them have been House bills that go through the legislature. It's been about 50-50 here. The newest iteration of that would be House Bill 4401, and this came into play right at the end of December. During 2020, there were actually 3 different meetings of the legislature in special sessions for them to go through this process. And so this was the very last one. Prior to this, the idea was that the eviction moratorium was actually set to expire at the very end of 2020, and there was a lot of concern. So this happened right before the end there and created protections that go all the way out until June 30th of this year. It also created a landlord compensation fund too. So that was kind of a new part to this. A lot of these things are similar. I'll share where we're at what the protections look like with all 4 of these involved. Unfortunately for the new iteration, there is some devils in the details. So we need to make sure that individuals know whether they are qualified for an eviction moratorium or they are unqualified. There's now actually specific designations between those 2. If an individual is qualified, which I'll say in just a moment, they have to sign a declaration and give that back to their landlord. This means in that declaration, What would qualify them is at some point between last March to now, really all the way up until June 30th of this year, they have been unable to pay some amount of rent. It doesn't have to be the whole amount of rent, just some part of the rent because of COVID-related needs. So that would be a loss of income, a loss of job hours. It would be excessive medical needs as well, or medical debt. All of those are true. They would have to sign a declaration, hand it over to their landlord, and they are officially protected. Those that qualify, sign it, send it. They are protected from any evictions, and there's a freeze on their rent all the way up until July 1st of this year. So come July 1st, not only is July's rent due, but any missed back rent in this entire time would become due as well. For those that haven't signed that declaration yet, not only would starting this last January 1, rent is due for January, February, the same, March, now we're into April. Any back rent that they owed would also come due March 31st. So we just passed that deadline. To give you a little sense of that, for non-qualifying tenants, any rent from last April to the end of December came due March 31st. That could be quite a bit chunk of change. So even if they hadn't signed a declaration just yet, they had this back rent, they were still working on paying it off, and they were able to pay January rent or February rent, March. If April, they can't pay April's rent and what's back due, they can always sign that declaration. They can sign it at any time between now and the end of June. If an individual has signed it or will sign it, any rent from last April all the way until the end of June is currently due come July 1st. So there's a protection in any rent that might be missed up until that point, and any of that back rent would then be due at that point. I see, I'm going to try and answer some of these questions as we go through, but I might miss them, but I'll send the entire document to you afterwards. So I do see one about loss of income. If a parent had to quit to take care of children, that would be a loss of income. So yes, that would be COVID related due to childcare. And so then there was lost job times there. Yep. Okay, so until a tenant hands over that declaration, at that point, anytime during this, since January of this year, a landlord can start moving forward with notices for non-payment of rent. So if they haven't signed it either in January, February, so on, then the landlord can start moving forward going, hey, you owe me rent, not only the current rent, but now officially, since we're past that June 30th, now you owe all this back rent too. However, with that is the moment that a landlord hands over one of those notices, they also have to send over a copy of that declaration form. So the same form that a tenant would sign saying, hey, at some point I missed rent during this time, they get that copy. The tenant can sign it in the moment that they're handed it. They also have an extension on how long that notice is. So they can wait, they can read through it, they can sign it. They need to get it back to their landlord. What's really exciting about this is I think for the first time in Oregon law, we have actually used the word text. Ta-da! So a tenant can return that notice by hand, by mail, by email, or take a picture of it and send it to their landlord. All of those qualify as ways that you have returned that to your landlord. It can be really important to make sure that there's documentation that the landlord has received that. So when available, I would definitely go with texting or email, because then you can have a document saying that you sent it over. If doing it by mail, keep copies of all of these things as well. If you do it by mail, you can also do it with a certificate of mailing too, so you can showcase that that went over. The notices that an individual might receive in the past would be what is called a 44-hour notice of non-payment of rent, which is really just the fancy way of saying a late fee. You have a late fee. Or a 72-hour notice, hey, you haven't paid rent, you haven't paid a late fee. Come on, let's figure this out. Both of those notices stand, but during this moratorium time, there's actually additional time put on them. So now they're no longer these hour-long notices. They would either be a 10-day notice or a 13-day notice. So people have additional time to make sure that they're reading through that declaration. And that will go until the end of this moratorium. So all of those notices will remain in effect at that longer period for at least the moratorium. If a tenant still hasn't signed it by the time that that has come and gone, the 10, 13 days have come and gone, no rent has come due, nothing has moved, the landlord can move forward with starting a notice with the court system and starting the eviction process. However, the tenant really has up until going to that first hearing. If they present the declaration right there, the eviction stops on the spot. So you might have some landlords that forget to add the declaration or just don't know. There's a lot of law changes right now, and they don't add it to the notices. Even if a tenant tries to present it and they don't accept it or they don't know what it is, it's a little overwhelming, but even if a tenant holds back until the eviction is filed with the court and they can go to that hearing and present it and also possibly present evidence that they've tried to give it to their landlord before, the eviction will immediately stop. I have heard stories recently of landlords either potentially knowingly trying to push a tenant into paying rent or not knowing that this is still a situation or that we still have a moratorium. So the court systems will know that they need to stop any of these dead on the tracks if that is presented at the hearing. I know that that feels like a 13th hour, so not recommended when possible. Also, a tenant doesn't have to wait until the landlord gives them the declaration. This can be proactive too. So a tenant can hand that over at any time. They do not have to wait for a notice from the landlord. What it will do for those that do qualify for this is it bans specific evictions all the way up until the end of June. So those evictions being non-payment of rent, surprise, surprise, or other utilities, other services, or fees owed to the landlord. So if there is any money that needs to be owed to the landlord, all of those would be stopped by this moratorium. Any no-cause eviction notices that an individual might receive. The only situation that a no cause could move forward would be after the first year of vacancy, if a landlord chooses to use what is called a landlord-based reason to evict. So they have either sold the home, they're planning on demolishing the home, doing major repairs that the tenant couldn't live there during that time, or they plan to move it into it themselves. Those no-cause evictions would currently stand regardless if somebody put in a declaration or not. They can move forward with those no causes. I will come back to that one though. Statewide, if an individual is asked to leave for one of those 4 reasons and the landlord owns more than 5 units, 5 or more units specifically, then the tenant, at the time they receive that notice, they get 1 month's worth of rent. It's a relocation assistance. We'll talk about it also when we talk about Portland specifically, because there's a little more details. Portland has its own relocation assistance. But statewide, that's how that would go. This would also ban any non-renewal notices. So if somebody's lease was about to end during this time frame, anytime in the moratorium between last April to actually all the way up until the end of this August, then what it would do is freeze the terms of that lease right now as the same thing all the way until the end of this August. The tenant would still have to leave at the end of August, but they would be able to stay in their tenancy up to that long. And then between now and the end of this coming June, landlords can also not charge late fees on any of this, and they cannot report any non-payments to credit bureaus. They're not allowed to report those to credit bureaus. I have a big concern that as people choose to move out or move to a different apartment, that we're going to see a lot of people possibly get denied for places because of their credit. Even if landlords are not able to report to credit bureaus, there is a high possibility that some folks have been using credit cards to try and maintain. And that is still getting reported to credit bureaus. So one of the bills that I'm going to talk about briefly is hoping to address one of those causes. So I'll chat about that. If a tenant does attempt to pay any amount of rent during this time, a landlord can choose to accept that, but they have to use it in a very specific order. They can't charge it wherever they want. It has to be for current rent. If all of that is settled, then they can move on to utility charges, then late rent, and then any other fees or damages. It always has to go in that order. It is important to know, though, that some landlords are still going to give notices stating that an individual owes them a certain amount of money. They cannot collect on that money. It is not a notice to terminate. It's just a notice to inform you at this point, this is how much money is owed to your landlord. That is fine for them to give those types of notices. It is also okay for them to give eviction notices based on reasons to evict. So if there are loud parties going on or the lease agreement has been broken in some way, shape, or form. I think the one that we're concerned about and one of the bills that we're working on is attempting to address is guests staying over or staying for an extended amount of time is also a situation that currently a landlord can move to evict because it's against the lease policy, depending on what that might look like in somebody's lease. So individuals can still do that. Also, landlords can choose to deduct any past rent. So if somebody's lease was going to expire during this time and they're kind of on freeze, if they've paid a deposit, then in those situations, a landlord can choose to deduct any rent that was owed to them from that deposit, the security deposit. And then most importantly, if a landlord violates any of these parts of this specific law at this point, then a landlord is liable for up to 3 months worth of rent plus actual damages. So if they did not give a notice, if they did not give enough time, so if they used an old form and it was a 72-hour notice, that would be a violation of this law. So that is where that stands. One thing that I'm going to switch over to is I'm going to talk about the Landlord Compensation Fund, and then there's some questions, so I'll get back to those ones. Landlord Compensation Fund is really quick in here, but it is important that they have this. So the last bill organized this Landlord Compensation Fund. Landlords can now request rent assistance from the state on behalf of their tenants without the tenants having to look for that rent assistance. So the idea is to have a two-prong approach here. Both tenants have access to some funding, and now landlords can do it too, so that that burden doesn't always fall on the tenants. What the purpose of this or the plan was and is that agencies, it would be the Oregon Housing and Community Services holds this pot of money. They'll work with local housing authorities in different areas to come up with a payment plan so checks can go out pretty quickly to landlords. They would go directly to landlords. They wouldn't go to the tenants for the landlords, but they would be on behalf of the tenants. The priority is going to be set at smaller landlords, and then landlords also that have a higher percentage of unpaid rent to them. So those are going to be the two focuses, but they will be looking at all applications. Those will just become the priorities during this time. If a landlord was to be paid out by this program, it is only going to pay out 80% of what each individual tenant owes and not the full 100%. So it'd be 80 cents on the dollar for all rent. The other 20%, a landlord has to forgive. So they can't come back to the tenant and go, all right, I got my 80, where's my 20? They have to just let it go. It is also important in this situation that this is optional for landlords to choose to opt in and go through the state route to get this funding. They don't have to, they can wait to get it all from the tenant. But the idea and notion here is more than likely they would have better time accepting and accessing this 80% from the state than they would getting the full 100% from their tenants at this point. And then the funding right now is set at $150 million. How Oregon Housing and Community Services has set this up is they're doing kind of 3 different phases where they will open funding up, let anybody apply as possible. They'll review those, they close it, and then each phase is $50 million. So they've finished phase 1. Phase 2 was set to open April 1st, but I don't see the website functioning again. So wait for it. It will be, they said April 1st to the end of April. So it will happen at this point. I will send out links to get to that website and all the details for that. A landlord can apply multiple times through each of these phases. It isn't just a one and done. It is only for past due rent though. So if they applied now in April, they can't be asking for May rent. They would have to wait for the second or the third phase for that. They have to go back. Even if a landlord gets denied for this, they can always reapply and possibly get the past rent that they didn't get the first time around too. This has been a really challenging stretch for OHCS to come up pretty darn quickly with creating a website and a portal and a whole service around this. So I would say that everybody felt like for the first phase, it was rough. Hopefully the second phase will get better and they will get better as they go through this process. But I think everybody has been willing to work with one another, even if they were a little frustrated. We might see more funding depending on what the federal government does go into systems like this. But regardless if there is money that comes from the federal government, it can't replace this. It has to add on to this 150 million. It can't just be like, oh, we're going to take that back and use it over here. So it has to be in addition. Okay, I'll look into the future very briefly, and then I will go back and talk about questions before I go into then more localized law. So the two bills that I'm currently watching, they're both Senate bills. There is one that is Senate 282, and there's a -4 amendment, fancy talk there. And so what this is going to do is it's more so not necessarily looking at extending the moratorium, but it is talking about extending the grace period. So instead of having rent all due come July 1, then it's going to move that out to next February. So any back rent that is owed would possibly have to go until next February, slowly can be paid down, give people a little bit more opportunity to pay on that. There are other provisions in there too. One of them that I'm excited about is that landlords, if somebody is moving and they have any debt owed to a past landlord during this time, future landlords cannot take that into consideration about whether or not they should rent to that person. There are some opportunities in the bill too to talk about who is a tenant, who is an occupant. So if individuals have guests that are staying for extended stays during this time, they can't be necessarily in breach of their own contract with the landlord or their own lease. It's looking like there's a large conversation around that part of this bill. So that's the one that's changing the most. It is looking like landlords will still be able to screen these long-term applicants for safety reasons, making sure that there aren't any concerns when it comes to their criminal history or rental history, but not necessarily income. So it wouldn't be income. The tenant who was the main tenant will still be responsible for all the rent. This individual just needs to be a safe individual of the property. The other bill that it's out there too is Senate Bill 330, and it's got a -5 to it. So they've been talking quite a bit. And that is looking at how to support landlords when it comes to tax credits for that lost rent of the 20% or any lost rent if they choose not to opt into the landlord compensation fund. So it's a different alternative for landlords to recoup any of the lost rent that they would have seen during this time. Both of these have pretty heated arguments around them too. So I'm excited to see where they're going to go. And I think that there is a possibility that maybe they might end up joining forces at some point and kind of come to a happy middle ground in between, or they might still remain two separate bills, and we'll see how they interact. All right. With that being said, we've got a few different comments and questions. Terry, it's looking like you, my wonderful monitor, can't see any of the questions, so none of the questions are helpful, right? Okay, cool. Let me open that up if I can. Okay, that should be helpful from here on. So then, other questions that have come through. What if they were evicting or giving notice because they wanted to sell the home but haven't yet? Good question. So that's not a reason. When it comes to those landlord-based reasons to evict, those 4 that I talked about and we'll talk about again, it has to be if they have accepted an offer of sale on the home. So it can't just be like, I don't know, I feel like it. They have to at least have that accepted offer. Now, if the offer falls through, that's not necessarily the landlord's fault. That was the individual who was attempting to buy the home. Their offer just fell through on the table. So as long as they have that offer, then they can move forward with those eviction notices. Okay, next. Oh, perfect. I'm so glad that you asked this. How do you know if a landlord received their fund through the compensation fund, right? It's important that we don't get to a place where landlords are receiving 80% of what's owed to them. They're forgiving the other 20, and yet the tenants have no idea at all that that money was given on their behalf to their tenant or their landlord. And heaven forbid we have a landlord that goes, hey, tenant, nobody has paid me money yet. Give me your money. Like, we don't want the double dipping. So this is where that declaration paperwork comes into play. A tenant has to sign that declaration in order for their landlord to go to the state and request funds on their behalf. So first, that needs to be there. That also gives the state an opportunity to know who the tenants are. And so then as payments are being made, notices will go out to the tenants as well. So then there's documentations on the tenant side, as well as the landlords that those have been paid on the tenant's behalf. So they can collect that info. I would also imagine as a catch-all, if an individual goes to the landlord compensation website and they're a tenant wanting to see if their landlord has received funds on them, that they could contact somebody at the state level, and that state level individual could look that up pretty easy and provide documentation if they haven't already received that. Good question. Okay. So now I'm going to get into some of the more local things as we go trucking along. So Multnomah County did indeed, surprise, have something specifically for Multnomah County in which they had their own protections beyond what the state level did. They had those protections set out for July 2nd, 2021, because they just wanted to beat the state by 1 day. Why not? They also had a repayment plan that was set for 6 months into the future too. So any back rent owed during this time period, if somebody still lived in Multnomah County, even though July 1 showed up and everybody else across the state now has all their back rent due, those in Multnomah County don't have that due until January 1st, 2022. And in this situation, tenants also did not have to provide any documentation to their landlord. Just the mere fact of them living in Multnomah County was grounds enough that they deserve this eviction moratorium. Super great. Portland just went, hey, we'll just do whatever the county does. What they're doing, we'll do it too. We don't need to figure that out. There are some parts of Portland that are outside of Multnomah County, so this would combine all of that. So pretty much they were the lady from When Harry Met Sally. Unfortunately, Multnomah County went, this is rather confusing. And the state had just put in these great protections that went for the 6 months of this year. We want to make sure everybody's on the same page. Never mind the protections that we said that our tenants had in Multnomah County is not. So then everybody across the state is all covered under the Oregon state protections. Why I think they rescinded their own is because tenants did not have to sign that declaration form. Then if a landlord wanted to get the landlord compensation fund, they didn't have documentation to go through that process. So I really feel like that was a key factor in why they went, this is going to get really confusing the closer we get. So let's just call it quits and we'll see what happens. They did say, however, as we get towards the end of this statewide moratorium, as we start creeping towards July, they are willing to look at protections specifically for Multnomah County, just in case they need to. So they're willing to revisit this, but in the meantime, they wanted to back off of that. So in the end, they just decided to have a salad. All right. But I still want to talk about Portland specifically because of that fancy little relocation fund that they have. That comes into play through this. Relocation in the city of Portland, so as long as the unit is within the city limits of Portland, can be triggered by a few different things. Certain eviction notices or termination notices, an increase in rent more than 10% in a year, or if there are massive changes to a lease agreement. For this, we're going to focus on those fancy termination notices. So termination notices, if an individual receives a no-cause eviction notice. Now remember, if they sign that declaration, they cannot receive this, but if they didn't sign that, they might be able to receive an eviction notice for no cause. Same with that non-renewal of lease too. They may possibly, if they haven't signed the declaration, be able to receive this non-renewal lease. And then in any given situation, the landlord still may come back to this landlord-based reason to evict. Regardless if somebody signed that declaration or not, these are on the table. So demolishing, major repairs or renovations, moving a landlord or their family into the unit, or they accepted that offer of sale. So with all three of these, it requires a 90-day notice from the landlord to the tenant, informing the tenant of these changes. If the tenant doesn't come back for at least the first two, for the no cause or the non-renewal, and go, hey, wait, here's my declaration, they can move forward with those. And in the situation that they move forward with any of these three, it requires the landlord within 45 days to give relocation assistance to the tenant. It does not matter how many units they have. Unlike the statewide protection, it doesn't land on that. What it does pay out on is the size of the unit that the individual is currently living in. And so if somebody's in a studio, it's $2,900. It can go up to 3 or more bedrooms, which is $4,500. Now, say there's a situation where a landlord owns 5 or more units and they're in the city of Portland. That landlord isn't required to pay the state relocation and Portland relocation. They just have to pay whichever one is higher and then prove that they paid it. So it's not double, but it's some of that. And with that, I'm at the end of my presentation. Thank you all so much.